The cradle had taken me nearly 3 months to complete. Every curve, every joint, every polished line carried with it the hours I gave after work and before bed. The weight of memory and the hope that it would be received as love. I had chosen the cedar carefully, running my hand along the planks at the mill until I found pieces with the right balance of strength and warmth. I sanded them so smooth my palms blistered, then softened again. In the evenings, the smell of lemon oil and varnish lingered in my kitchen, following me to bed like a promise. It wasn't just a cradle. It was part of me. When the baby shower came, I loaded it into the car with more care than I'd shown my own belongings in years. I wrapped it in an old quilt, left the trunk slightly open, and drove as though one sharp turn might undo months of work. I imagined Drew's face when he saw it. Maybe surprise, maybe pride. I imagined Nora smiling in approval, seeing me not as some old woman with little to offer, but as someone who could still create something meaningful. My chest tightened with hope I didn't dare name. The house was already brimming with guests when I arrived. Balloons bobbed in pastel clusters on the porch, laughter spilling out of the open windows. I carried the cradle up the steps slowly, my arms straining. A few heads turned, neighbors and Nora's friends, their chatter dipping briefly before continuing again. No one offered to help. I told myself it was fine. I was fine. I found Drew near the punch bowl, phone in hand, eyes down. He barely glanced up when I called his name, though his smile flickered at the edges. I pointed toward the cradle on the porch, pride rising like a tide in my chest. "I made that," I whispered. My voice sounded smaller than I intended, almost swallowed by the music playing from the speakers. It was Nora who heard me. She turned, her laugh sharp enough to slice through the air. "Oh, we don't need your junk," she said, striding toward the porch in heels that clicked against the wood. Before I could move, she had grabbed the side rail. The cradle groaned as she dragged it, bumping it against the step, pulling it past the hedges until it rested crooked beside two overflowing garbage bins at the curb. I stood frozen, hands limp at my sides, the sting of sanding still raw in my palms. The crowd inside kept their polite smiles. No one gasped, no one intervened. Neighbors, Nora's coworkers, even my old friend from church, they all looked away, their silence deafening. That was the cruelest part. The cradle could be dismissed, dragged like unwanted clutter. But the stillness of the people around me, people I thought would defend me, cut deeper than any word. Nora smoothed her dress, called out, "Sorry about that. Some things just don't match the theme." The group around her laughed. My son didn't. He stayed by the doorway, one hand in his pocket, one hand on his phone, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't stop her. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. Something hollow opened inside me. But I smiled weakly anyway, as though saving face could stitch over the wound. I walked to my car in slow, deliberate steps, the sound of laughter still behind me. No one stopped me, not even Drew. The drive home was quiet. Too quiet. My trunk was open again, the cradle barely fitting, wrapped in the quilt like a body I was carrying back from war. I told myself I would leave it in the garage for a while, maybe fix the scratches Nora's dragging had left on the rail. But every time I passed it, a heaviness grew in my chest. I couldn't look at it without seeing her hands yanking it toward the curb. The next morning, my phone rang. Drew's name lit up the screen. My heart leapt ridiculous, really. But I let hope surge one more time. Maybe he'd call to apologize. Maybe he'd ask if I'd made it home safe, if my hands were sore, if I needed company. Instead, his voice came light, casual. "Hey, Mom, quick thing. We're short on a few nursery items. Nora really wants this wallpaper. Designer brand, a little pricey, but you know her taste." He chuckled softly. "It's about $4,200. Could you maybe help us out with that?" No mention of the cradle. No mention of yesterday. Just money. I wanted to ask him if he had seen what she did, if he thought it was okay, if silence was his version of agreement. I wanted to tell him how the wood still smelled of cedar oil, how the corners of my palms were bruised from the hours I had given. But I didn't. I said yes. Of course yes. My voice was steady, my pen stroke clean as I wrote the check. That's what mothers do. They give even when it costs more than anyone notices, even when no one says thank you. Later that night, a text came from Nora, a heart emoji and a picture of the wallpaper sample. "So perfect," she wrote. "Can't wait to see it in the room. No mention of the cradle. No recognition of the check. Just perfect." The following week, I brought over a small bag of baby socks I had knitted white with tiny blue edges. No one answered when I knocked, but the door was slightly ajar. I stepped inside, calling out, "Hello?" The house was quiet except for a voice upstairs. Nora's voice. She was pacing, phone pressed to her ear. I was about to call again when her words caught me still. "She's harmless," Nora said, her tone light, almost amused. "Let her help while it's useful. After the baby, we'll set boundaries. You know how moms can be." A pause, then laughter, sharp and dismissive. She means well, but she's a lot. The word echoed inside me. Harmless, not kind. Not generous. Not even respected. Just harmless. Like an old tool kept in the drawer until it dulls completely, then tossed away. I stood there halfway up the stairs, my hand gripping the socks in my coat pocket. My throat burned, but no tears came. Quietly, I stepped back, eased the door shut, and left Dot in the car. The baby socks stayed in my pocket. I stared at the steering wheel until the house blurred through the windshield. They weren't just taking from me. They were timing me, counting down the usefulness of my love. Every check, every gift, every moment of effort, it all had an expiration date. I didn't cry. Instead, a stillness settled in, heavier than sorrow but clearer than rage. Something had shifted. And though I didn't know what I would do yet, I knew one thing for certain. The letting was going to stop. The cradle stayed in my garage, still wrapped in its quilt. The cedar smell faint but persistent, like it refused to be forgotten. Days turned into weeks. I busied myself with small tasks, grocery runs, laundry, knitting, baby socks I never delivered. Each time the phone buzzed with Drew's name, my stomach twisted. I answered anyway. Always yes. Always another check. A stroller. A glider chair. Designer bedding. Hospital bills. The amounts piled up. The balance of my account shrinking while the silence of gratitude grew larger. The worst part was how normal it became. They never apologized. They never asked how I was. I kept giving, because that's what mothers do, I told myself. Okay? We give until there's nothing left to give. But each time, the cradle in the garage felt heavier, as though it was holding all the words I hadn't said. Then came the email. It arrived past midnight, when I was half asleep, expecting a receipt or a forwarded baby photo. But the subject line read, "Oops." Inside was a screenshot from Nora to her mother after the christening. "We'll finally have space again. Can't wait to reset boundaries. She's too involved." Beneath it, just one line. "Sorry, wrong thread." Too involved. The words landed like stones. After every bill, after the cradle, after the booties and groceries and countless checks, I wasn't family. I was interference, disposable. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred, waiting for tears, but none came. Only clarity, cold, sharp clarity. The next morning, I pulled out a suitcase I hadn't touched since before Drew's wedding. I didn't slam drawers or throw clothes. There was no anger left in Moan. A deliberate kind of calm, packed light. A few shirts, jeans, toiletries. Then I walked to the garage. The cradle sat there, still under its quilt. For the first time in weeks, I pulled the cover off and let my fingers trace the curves of the wood. It had survived. Even after being dragged to the curb, even after being forgotten, it remained steady. I lifted it carefully into the car, strapping it in with old towels. By noon, I was on the road, the horizon stretching wide. I didn't leave a note. They wouldn't notice I was gone until they needed something. And by then, I intended to be somewhere else entirely. The first few nights on the coast were strange. The rented cottage creaked with the wind, the waves crashing against the rocks below. The garage smelled of salt and dust, not cedar. At night, I lay awake listening to the ocean, wondering if Drew had noticed my absence yet. Part of me hoped he had. Another part knew he hadn't. The silence from my phone confirmed it. But silence can be freeing. On the fourth day, I unpacked the boxes I'd carried with me. Sketches curled with age, chisels dulled from neglect, scraps of old varnished wood that still smelled faintly of who I used to be. The garage that had felt like a coffin shifted, became a space waiting for breath. Waiting for me, I set the cradle on the workbench. It looked smaller now, not like a failure, but like a reminder. My hands found the sandpaper almost instinctively. I began smoothing the arms, slow strokes, cedar dust rising like ghosts. Hours slipped by unnoticed. By midnight, my palms ached, but the wood gleamed. The rhythm of sanding was steady, familiar, like a heartbeat I'd almost forgotten. The next morning, I called Leslie. She had been one of my earliest clients, a shop owner with an eye for reclaimed beauty. My heart hammered as the line rang. When she answered, her voice was warm with recognition. "Calla, oh my God, are you okay?" I laughed softly, startling myself. "Actually, I think I am." A pause, then a breath. "What do you need?" "Think I'm ready to come back," I told her. She didn't hesitate. "Then come by tomorrow. Bring whatever you've got." The following day, I loaded the cradle into the truck, not to give it away, not to beg for it to be wanted, but to show it, to show myself. Leslie's eyes widened when she saw it. She placed it in the front window of her shop, angled toward the street. It was the first thing customers saw when they walked by. Within a week, it sold to a woman from Portland for double what I would have dared charge. My hands shook when I held the check, not from disbelief, but from something close to relief. The work didn't stop there. Leslie quietly submitted one of my newer pieces to the regional makers fair. When I found out, my instinct was to say no, too much attention, too much risk, but the cradle won first prize. Suddenly, orders trickled in. Then flowed. A photo of me, hair tied back, apron stained, hands steady on a chisel, circulated online under the headline, "The Cradle Maker Returns." I didn't smile for the cameras. I didn't give interviews. I just kept working. Sawdust filled. The air varnish stained my apron, cedar oil seeped into my skin. It was not a burden, it was freedom. My name, my time, my skill were mine again. I was no longer someone's lifeline or wallet. I was Calla Jensen, builder, artist, business owner. Leslie offered me a permanent corner of her showroom. She even asked if I would teach a weekly class. The question startled me, but for the first time in decades, I didn't hesitate. I said yes at night. I sat on the porch with coffee, watching the mist lift from the ocean. My hands ached from sanding, but it was a good ache. A reminder I was still moving, still making. Peace crept in, tentative but steady. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. I no longer lived waiting for thanks that would never come. The silence was no longer absence, it was mine. Still, sometimes when the waves grew too loud and the night too still, I thought of Drew. I wondered if he knew I was gone, if Nora had mentioned it in passing, or if they were too consumed by the nursery, the baby, the bills. Part of me braced for the day he would find me. Not with joy, not with hope, but with certainty. Because he would. And when he did, I knew the question he would bring. I also knew, for the first time in my life, what my answer would be. It was 3 months before the knock came. By then, the cottage by the coast had become more than a refuge. It was a workshop, a sanctuary, a place where my hands remembered who I was before I became a bottomless well of giving. The garage smelled of cedar, varnish, and salt air. My arms ached every night from carving, sanding, polishing, but it was the ache of creation, not sacrifice. Orders streamed in, some from locals, some from cities I hadn't visited in decades. Leslie displayed my work in her showroom, and every week a new customer admired, touched, purchased. My name returned to lips that spoke it with respect, not dismissal. Calla Jensen. The cradle maker. I thought perhaps I could live the rest of my life in that rhythm coffee at dawn, with shavings curling across the floor by noon, Quiet satisfaction by dusk. I thought perhaps the silence from Drew and Nora would stretch on forever. And I could keep it that way. But silence never lasts. Not when need exists. The tires crunched against the gravel one Wednesday afternoon, followed by the knock, hesitant, almost apologetic. I wiped my hands on a cloth and opened the door. Drew stood there. He looked thinner than I remembered, his shirt wrinkled, hair unkempt, eyes rimmed with sleepless red. Behind him, his car idled crookedly in the drive, exhaust puffing into the cold air. "Mom," he said, voice rough, "can we talk?" I stepped aside. He entered slowly, gaze flicking around the workshop as though it were a foreign country. His eyes lingered on the cradles, on the polished finish of a chair waiting for pickup. He ran his hand along the edge of the wood. "This is yours." I nodded. "Every piece." He looked down, shame flickering across his face. "I didn't know you were doing all this again." I stayed quiet. Silence, I had learned, was sometimes sharper than words. He swallowed, shifting his weight. "Things have been hard. The mortgage is behind. Nora's been out of work since the baby. The baby's been sick. The bills just keep stacking up." His voice tightened, rushed, as though he wanted to get through the words before they suffocated him. "We really need help." There it was. Not an apology. Not a question about me. Just a request. I stared at him. My son? The boy I had held through storms and sickness. The man who had stood silent while his wife dragged my cradle to the curb. The man who had let my love become a transaction. He couldn't even meet my eyes. "I'm not your lifeline anymore, Drew," I said evenly. His head jerked up, eyes wide. "So you're just going to let us fall apart?" I shook my head. "You already did that." I just stopped trying to cushion the landing. His face hardened. "You're choosing money over your family." A soft, sad smile pulled at my lips. "No, I'm choosing peace over disrespect." He stared at me, waiting for me to break, to backtrack, to fold as I always had. I didn't. The silence stretched, heavy but steady. Eventually, his shoulders sagged. He turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him without a slam. The sound of his car pulling away faded down the gravel road until all that remained was the ocean's rhythm. I stood for a long time, letting the stillness settle back into place. Then I turned to the workbench, picked up the chisel, and began again. A week later, Leslie forwarded me a photograph. It was from a boutique in Manhattan. There, in the center of a street-facing window, stood one of my cradles, its maple grain glowing under the lights. Beside it, etched into a brass plaque, were the words, "Designed by Calla Jensen." Handcrafted with story. I stared at the image until my throat tightened, not with disbelief, but with recognition. That cradle had never been trash. Not when Nora dragged it across the porch. Not when they laughed. Not when they dismissed me as harmless, too involved, disposable. It was never junk. It simply wasn't for them. The following morning, I sat on the porch with hot coffee, the mist lifting from the sea. My hands ached from sanding late into the night, but I didn't mind. The ache meant I was still alive, still making. The piece I'd chosen wasn't loud or grand. It was quiet, steady, woven into mornings like this coffee, ocean air, cedar dust. I had lost a son, or perhaps I had simply stopped pretending I hadn't already lost him long ago. But in that loss, I had found someone else. I found the woman I had been before motherhood became transaction. The woman who built with care, who carried her name with respect. I found myself a delivery van pulled into the drive. The man stepped out, clipboard in hand. "You, Calla Jensen?" I smiled. "I am." He handed me the invoice. "This one's going to a senator's wife." I signed without hesitation. Then walked back into the workshop, rolled up my sleeves, and set to work again.